about history of science, environment, and writing. And so I love the complementary nature of your work with what we try to do here at Lakeside. And she's a historian, she's a writer, associate professor at UC Santa Cruz. Please join me in giving her a warm Lakeside welcome.
I want to start, thank you everybody. I just turned on my microphone. I've never been too quiet in my entire life. And so if that for some reason happens tonight, just give me a signal and I will turn it up. But I wanted to begin tonight by thanking everyone for coming out. It's such a pleasure to be here. I took a beautiful walk through the prairie today. Turns out that the prairie is actually super loud with all of the birds and grasses. And I'm just really excited to have a conversation about some of the research that I do with all of you. So I did want to start by saying just a few words about who I am and how I ended up here. So as Mary said, I'm a historian who works in between several fields. So I'm broadly interested in the intersections and the relationships among the histories of science, medicine, and the environment. I'm also interested in questions of the economy, which you'll see tonight as I start to talk through my research. My primary site of research is the Middle East and North Africa, and specifically I've done a lot of work in Egypt, where I lived for about a decade of my life. And so the talk that I'm going to give you tonight and the conversation that we'll have, much of that material comes from a book that I published a couple of years ago, and while it might seem very, very far away, the argument that I'll make is that the questions that I'm thinking through and the questions that I'm engaged with are questions that are significant in the Middle East and North Africa, and they are significant wherever we are. So I'm going to raise some questions about the intersections among environmental transformations and human health, and how those transformations really have come to shape the knowledge and practice of medicine. So I thought that in the spirit of generosity tonight, I would start with several questions rather than an argument, with the notion that those are questions that we might be able to explore together later on. These are questions that I've been thinking with for a while, but that thinking has shifted. And so I'm really eager to have a conversation, to hear what's going on locally related to these questions, and to think about how different sites on the globe compare to one another and how we can think with those sites together. So the questions that I'm thinking through and the ones that I wanted to raise tonight were twofold. The first of those questions is, how has the history of environmental change shaped the knowledges and the practices that inform medicine and the treatment of human health? So as you'll see in a very clear way in several minutes, I'm going to link these questions of massive environmental transformation with broader shifts in human health and also medical practice. But maybe more importantly, and especially as we think about the environmental change that we are living through today, I'm really interested in thinking about how we can actively shape the knowledge and practice of medicine in a way that's specific and beneficial in particular localities, and in a way that feels, I want to say, bottom up and informed by the experiences of those people living on the ground, rather than a kind of universalist theory from on high. And so the story that I'm going to tell today will have two basic beginning points. And as with most renditions of history, there are many places that we could begin, but I'm going to offer an interpretation of two of those places. So the first one of those places would begin with the first dam that was constructed on the Nile River in Egypt. So the image that you're looking at right now, should we make it darker? Yeah, okay. The image that will come into high focus in just a moment is an image of the 1902 Aswan Dam, which is known locally in Egypt as Khazan Aswan. Khazen Aswan was the first dam that was constructed on the Nile River. It was a storage dam, which for people who are not intimately engaged with dams, that means it was constructed for the purposes of storing water for agriculture and specifically for irrigation. This was a dam that construction began on this dam in 1898 and it was completed in 1902. It is located in the deep south of Egypt. Let's see if I can use the pointer here. Yes. Okay, in and around the town of Aswan. So this is actually a tricky map because this is a map of a later Egyptian geography, an Egyptian geography that existed after the High Dam was built in 1970. For many centuries, the town of Aswan, because of issues of geography and the topography of the Nile, has functioned as the kind of effective southern border of Egyptian agriculture. So the dam that was built in 1902 was built near this town. It stored irrigation water that was released and funneled into irrigation canals that existed to the north of the dam. Now, the next question, and another point from which to tell this story, is connected to the history of cotton production, both in Egypt but also on a global scale. So when Khazen Aswan was constructed in Egypt, Egypt was a colony of the British. That was an occupation that had began in 1882. And it should be said that from the moment that the British occupied Egypt, they were very, very keen to increase Egyptian cotton production. So Egypt had begun to produce larger quantities of cotton beginning in the 1820s, and interestingly, in the 1860s, with the naval blockade of the Confederacy that happened in North America, so the naval blockade of the Confederacy, what that meant is that the American cotton that had once supplied textile mills in the north of England was no longer available. And so in other parts of the globe, and specifically in Egypt and India, these were sites that began to produce a lot more cotton, especially as the price of cotton rose. So when the British occupied Egypt in the early 1880s, they were almost immediately looking for ways to increase the amount of cotton that was grown in the country. And cotton was, for the entire period of the British occupation, a kind of cornerstone of the British colonial project in Egypt. Okay, so the story that I'm going to tell today about cotton and about the dam is going to have 4 different sequential pieces. And before I work through those pieces, I want to say just a quick sentence about each one of those pieces so that you know what to anticipate and how this history connects to one another. So the first piece of this history is connected to a changed environment. So the widespread cultivation of cotton in Egypt necessitated in many ways the construction of a dam and a transformation of Egypt's agricultural landscape and the ecologies that were attached to that landscape. Whenever we talk about a changed environment, and this is really fundamental to how I think about environmental change, we are always talking about changes in human practice, many of those changes connected to questions of labor. And when we're talking about physical labor, we're talking about labor that puts our bodies into new relationships with the environments in which we live and work. And sure enough, that is an important piece of the story that I'll tell today from Egypt. The third piece of this history is connected to questions of bodily experience. So the construction of a dam in Egypt, the spread of cotton cultivation, both of these things were connected to a shifting agricultural calendar that had dramatic effects on the bodies of Egyptian cultivators, both from the standpoint of labor and also from the standpoint of disease. Now, the final piece of this story, and I'm going to desperately not try to run out of time so that I can talk about this final piece, is one that is linked to structures of knowledge. So of the different historical convergences that are important in this story, this is a history that pulls in a changing practice of civil engineering, and specifically the ability to construct large dams. It is also a history that is linked to changes in the global economy. And in fact, a global economy that's intimately tied to the practice of colonialism and the production of agricultural products and goods in some parts of the globe that are then shipped to other parts of the globe. But both of these sort of massive historical shifts are also deeply linked to the history of medicine, and specifically the history of a medical practice that forms a kind of precursor for how many of us interact with biomedical systems in the contemporary world that we live in. So the first piece that I want to talk about is this question of a changed environment. And in order to talk about how the environment in Egypt evolved, I first need to spend a few minutes describing what the environment in Egypt was like before the construction of the dam and the widespread cultivation of cotton. So for at least several millennia before the construction of the dam, many parts of the Egyptian countryside were irrigated through an irrigation practice that was known as basin irrigation. So basin irrigation was an irrigation practice that tended to exist in parts of the globe in which oftentimes there were rivers and oftentimes rainfall was scarce in these regions. Both of those observations certainly describe Egypt. So the way that basin irrigation worked is through a connection of agriculture to the annual Nile flood. So before the damming of the Nile River, the Nile flooded each year. That was a flood that arrived sometime between late July and early August. And what would happen when the Nile flooded is that as the flood moved north along the river, Egyptian cultivators and local government officials would cut the banks of the Nile River so that it could fill these large basins that lined both the Nile Valley and also existed throughout the Nile Delta. So we're going to look at a map in just a second, but the Nile Delta is this fan-like alluvial structure that exists in the north of the country. And so what would happen is that flood waters would be channeled into these large basins, and they would be left in those basins for a period of time to soak the soil. And as they soaked the soil, they would not only deposit, obviously, water and the kind of sustenance that was needed to grow crops, but these were floodwaters that, as they moved from the mountains of Ethiopia and north along the Nile, filled with sediment, and that sediment was a rich fertilizer for crops. And so one of the purposes of basin irrigation was to water fields before the planting of crops. Another purpose of basin irrigation was to fertilize fields naturally before the planting of crops. And so after floodwaters were evacuated from these basins, these basins were left moist, and they were also left fertilized. And so after they were no longer filled with water, crops would be planted in these basins, and these were crops that were usually harvested in the wintertime or the springtime. Now, what was really important about basin irrigation is that it was connected to the temporality and the calendar of the annual Nile flood, meaning that Egypt's major crops were crops that could be grown according to that agricultural calendar. And so from the period that stretched between, for example, the 1600s and the late 19th century, one of Egypt's primary crops was wheat, which paired really well with the temporalities of the annual Nile flood. When Egypt was a part of the Ottoman Empire, whose capital was in Istanbul in Turkey, Egyptian wheat fed the empire and especially fed the elite in Istanbul. And so an important observation about basin irrigation is that while it was incredibly productive and effective at watering and fertilizing some crops, it could not do so sort of en masse for crops whose temporality did not match that of the annual Nile flood, and cotton was one of those crops. And so what happened after the construction, or the completion of Khazen S1 in 1902, was that the British colonial regime began to dig massive networks of irrigation canals, which replaced the basins that lined the Nile Valley and the Nile Delta. These were irrigation canals, which facilitated perennial irrigation, or basically year-round agricultural production. These irrigation canals were also central to carrying the waters that were stored by the dam into the fields that lined the Nile River. So I sometimes take this for granted, but I do think it's really important to say that historically there's been almost no rain-fed agriculture in Egypt. So Egypt gets very little rain each year, and what that means is that agriculture is almost entirely dependent on irrigation from the Nile River. So for the first decade of the 20th century, following the completion of the dam and the first project to heighten that dam and increase its storage capacity, these networks of irrigation canals spread throughout northern and central Egypt, which were the regions of Egypt where cotton grew best. And so the entire kind of structure, temporality, and practice of Egyptian agriculture changed dramatically in the first years of the 20th century. Now, just to give you a sense of the scale, following the completion of the first Aswan Dam, perennial irrigation, which was facilitated by the dam, spread to approximately 4 million of Egypt's 6.25 million cultivable acres. And this dam was raised twice. So it was raised once between 1907 and 1912, and again between 1929 and 1933. So each time it was raised, that increased the storage capacity of the dam, and consequently the surface area of the Egyptian countryside that was converted to perennial irrigation through the excavation of irrigation canals. Okay, so I want to give you, I'm terrible at making graphics, so you're going to have to forgive me for this. One day I'm going to have to fix this. But this is a rudimentary map of Egypt's agricultural landscape after the construction of the dam. So in 1902, what I call an irrigation frontier emerged in central Egypt, just north of the city of Asyut. And what that irrigation frontier meant is that the regions that lay to the north of this frontier had access to perennial irrigation and year-round agriculture and cotton cultivation, right? So those were things that were linked. And the areas that existed to the south of this frontier continued to practice basin irrigation and also farm the crops that had historically been present in Egypt before the construction of the dam. Now, the next sort of piece of this puzzle that I want to outline is connected to systems of practice, and specifically the system of labor. So, you know, I always try to tell this history in one way before pointing out the flaws with the way that I told it. And what I mean by that is, you might have noticed that in this first piece of dam construction, I used the passive tense quite a bit. Right? I talked about irrigation canals were dug, the dam was built, but what I did not do is describe the process through which those acts of infrastructure construction happened and the implications and effects of the systems of practice and labor that enabled the construction of new forms of infrastructure. So it's incredibly important to point out that canals only could come into existence and also stay in existence and continue to function through almost continuous human labor. And I want to really emphasize emphasize that when we talk about human labor here, this was labor that placed Egyptian cultivators into really intimate daily contact with the environments in which they lived and worked. And especially when we're thinking about canals, that consisted of the mud that formed really the Nile Basin and the Nile Valley. So canals obviously had to be excavated in the first instance. They were excavated by human laborers who often used their bare hands as shovels in order to do the work of digging. Also, because the Nile was so full of sediment and natural fertilizers, one effect of that was that in order to maintain their function, canals had to be cleared at least once a year, but oftentimes more than once a year, of the sediment that would accumulate in these canals and threaten to block them. So that process of excavation was really ongoing. Cultivators also came into really intimate forms of environmental contact through the act of irrigation. And I'm going to show you a couple of images in just a moment to give you a sense as to what that act of irrigation looked like. Finally, and I think really importantly, when irrigation canals started to crisscross the Egyptian countryside, those canals became central sites of agriculture, but also of daily life. So, as the Nile is a large river, I'm sure that many of you know this, and especially during flood, and when the Nile ran high, it ran very, very quickly, and it was dangerous to approach the river. Right, so all of those kinds of functions of daily life that one would need water for, washing clothes, children cooling off, urination and defecation, anything that you would think about as a function in which water would be helpful. As irrigation canals were dug proximate to Egyptian villages, those canals fed agriculture. They were also sites of a whole host of other daily functions. Because it was, they were much closer and it was much less treacherous to approach an irrigation canal than it was a large river with significant banks that were built up in order to contain that river. Okay, so I'm going to show you a succession of 3 images next. So this first image is my favorite image of the Inauguration Ceremony that followed the completion of the dam in 1902. So most photos of this ceremony are photos of the Egyptian elite and also British colonial administrators, dressed in their finest, standing on the dam, doing a bunch of kind of official functions in order to welcome the dam. The reason that I prefer this photo is that this photo is taken from the vantage point of the Egyptian residents of Aswan who lived close to the town and watched the ceremony from afar. Okay, so one of the questions that I really think about in my work is this question of how do we all sort of know and experience infrastructure? Okay, so when we have a personal experience of the construction of a dam, what are the different things that mean, and how does it affect us differently? Now, in this particular moment, when the dam was inaugurated, we have records of folk songs that were sung by laborers that were quite celebratory. So in Egypt's economy in the late 19th and early 20th century, mostly people would migrate north to the cities of Cairo and Alexandria because that's where most large construction projects and labor was concentrated. And so the construction of the dam in the south of Egypt represented a really rare occasion on which people who lived in the south had access to the wages of extra labor and especially skilled labor. So this was a moment of celebration, even if not quite the same form of celebration that existed for the kind of elite who you can see populating the top of the dam and along the banks. I feel like when you work in the colonial period, umbrellas or parasols are always a quick tip off to where the elite is standing in this story. here's another site, another way of experiencing the dam. This is an image of construction. And if you were much, much closer to this image, one of the things that you could see is that there are different forms of labor that built the dam. The dam was built by Italian stonemasons and Greek kind of skilled construction workers, but the hard labor of building the dam and assembling its masonry was done by Egyptian laborers, especially from the south of Egypt. This was also hot and miserable labor. So there are reports from the construction project of temperatures at the construction site reaching as high as 130 degrees. There were field hospitals set up to treat Egyptian laborers who suffered from heat stroke, some of whom died. There also were ice companies that moved to the south of Egypt to support the kind of medical facets of the process of construction. Now, the next two images I'm going to show are images of irrigation. So, one of the arguments that I make is that irrigation was, after the initial act of construction, the primary way in which most farmers came into contact with the dam. So they came into contact with the dam at the scale of an irrigation canal, and specifically the irrigation canal that they worked in. So generally speaking, during the late 19th and really for the first half of the 20th century, there were mechanical irrigation pumps in Egypt, but most irrigation was done by hand using a set of different implements. So the implement that you're seeing in this photo right here is an implement called a shidoof, which was a historical irrigation tool. And basically the way it worked is a farmer, there's a bucket right here, so there's a bucket right here, and at the end of this pole here, there's a counterbalancing weight. And so a farmer would use the shidoof to lift water from an irrigation canal into a smaller canal or also into the fields. Now, what is less evident in this photo is that this act of irrigation left the irrigator soaked by the water that filled irrigation canals. And so this is going to become very important as we move forward through this history. And so it's through the use of this tool that cultivators came into really close and frequent contact with the water that filled irrigation canals. This is another implement that was used to irrigate fields. This is called a tanbour, or an Archimedean screw, and basically it worked to screw water up or to spiral it up from these irrigation canals into fields. Now, this was an instrument, the use of which, even though the use of which did not emerge in the early 20th century, this is a historical irrigation implement, it became much more common in the early 20th century with the proliferation of irrigation canals throughout the countryside. Use of this instrument also placed farmers into much closer contact with the mud that formed irrigation canals and the water that filled them. So the next piece that I want to talk about today is this question of what I call bodily relationality. And so what I mean by that are the relationships that link our bodies to a broader material environment. Now, this is a good room to make this argument in because, as many of you I'm sure know, there is no such thing as a bounded, separate human body from the environments in which we all live. We are constituted by those environments. They live on our skin. In some ways, they constitute our skin. And so, environmental transformations don't produce these relationships, but they do change their nature in really important ways. And so, one of the questions that I think about a lot is this tension between how, in many really important ways, human bodies are deeply similar. Okay, so at many levels, we are able to have a practice of medicine that thinks about a more or less universal human body, because there are many things that are more similar about all of our bodies than different. And yet, there also are differences, and some of those differences are determined by questions of environmental interaction and also geography. And when I'm thinking about Egypt during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the construction of the dam and the shift in agricultural practice had really important implications for producing new and distinct experiences of the human body and of human health. One of the arguments that I want to make really strongly is these were experiences that were produced not exclusively, but predominantly through the act of labor. So in just a few minutes, I'm going to discuss a set of environmental diseases that are still with us today, that are often talked about as falling within the category of neglected tropical diseases. And the argument that I make is those diseases are often discussed in the absence of the systems of practice that cause people to be infected and to remain infected, work being one of those primary systems. So when we think about the damming of the Nile River and the spread of perennial irrigation was deeply significant because it meant that cultivators became a part of the ecologies that formed irrigation canals, right? So irrigation canals were new facets of the Egyptian countryside, and to do the work of agriculture meant that cultivators made those canals, they cleaned those canals, they were in contact with the mud from which they were formed, and they were also in constant contact with the water that filled those canals through the doing of agriculture. In addition to that, the introduction of new agricultural calendars in Egypt, and specifically the fact that agriculture was practiced year-round, meant that those human bodies had much more frequent, in fact year-round, contact with those environments, right? So obviously the work of doing agriculture, especially before the age of mechanization, was one in which people who labored in agriculture and farmers were really strongly connected to the environments in which they worked. But when those environments shifted, so did their health and their physical forms. And in Egypt, it became really important that the work of agriculture began to stretch the length of the annual cycle rather than being concentrated in just one season. I think we can turn on the fan if it's better. Okay, great. Okay, so I want to read just one quick thing before moving on to a discussion of disease. And that is that, when we think about labor, and specifically this form of agricultural labor, one of the primary experiences that was connected to this labor was an experience of pain. So work with both the tambour and also the shaduf, these irrigation implements, could be incredibly painful, and it was work that happened all year round. And so, for example, there's an Egyptian folk song that I have a record of that was sung in the early 20th century, and there are actually multiple folk songs of the genre that quote-unquote celebrated working with the shaduf, okay? And this folk song in particular said, "This morning I am weary, my entire body is sick, I am weary, I am weary. My hands are injured, I call out for a doctor, give me a good doctor, a bit of respite, I am weary, I am weary. My hands will heal, and then you will say, draw a bucket. The world is quite bad, because I cannot rest there. I am weary, I am weary." Now, I don't have time to talk about all the things in the world today, although I would love to, just if you might extend to 6 hours. But one of the comments that I want to make is that doing the work of irrigation was quite painful. Farming cotton and also sugarcane, which spread following the cultivation of the dam. These are historical crops that often have been associated with slavery for a complex set of reasons, but they are incredibly difficult, painful crops to produce. And so it's really important to make that note. It's also really important to note that in Egypt during the period of the British occupation, vast numbers of Egyptian farmers did not own their land. Okay, so they worked for large, wealthy landowners who themselves did not do the actual work of agriculture, which I would argue produces a changed relationship to the act of actually doing the farming. Okay, the spread of perennial irrigation in Egypt also resulted, importantly, in a dramatic uptick in the prevalence of a set of diseases. And the reasons, I'm going to talk in brief about how this happens with each one of these diseases, because the reasons are slightly different. So one of the diseases that becomes much more common in regions of Egypt that are perennially irrigated after the construction of the dam is hookworm. So hookworm is a parasitic disease. In Egypt, it was spread through a parasite named Schizophrenia duodenale. I always feel like that's a trick when I say that. I'm going to have to say it again. And in Egypt, generally, the disease was spread. So the eggs of hookworm parasites pass out of the human body in feces, and they are able to sort of exit the feces, move to the soil, and the organism sits there waiting for its next host to infect. Egypt is often, in many seasons of the year, a warm country. Farmers typically did not wear shoes and went barefoot, and so hookworm generally infected rural populations through the soles of your feet as you were walking on soil. It is theorized that it became much more prevalent after the construction of Khazen Aswan because the practice of year-round agriculture and perennial irrigation meant that the soil was perpetually moist, which was a more conducive environment for the transmission of hookworm. So we see, beginning in the late 19th century, but stretching really through the first half of the 20th century, a dramatic increase in the symptoms of hookworm infection in Egypt. So in the middle of the 1930s, the Rockefeller Foundation, which was a kind of primary player in global public health programs between World War I and World War II, they had a long-running project in Egypt, and one facet of this project was to measure rates of parasitic infection in Egypt. Hookworm was one of those infections, and so in 1934, James Allen Scott, who was a parasitologist who worked for the Rockefeller Foundation, estimated that 5 of Egypt's 12 million inhabitants were infected with hookworm. Okay, so hookworm was one of the diseases of perennial irrigation. Another disease of perennial irrigation is a disease called pellagra. Pellagra, one can become infected with pellagra, or one can develop pellagra through several different mechanisms. In Europe, the Middle East, and Africa, pellagra was most often associated with the spread of maize cultivation. Okay, so maize was a crop that has roots in the New World, as I'm sure many of you know. It is, in some ways, incredibly easy to produce and quick to produce. So as corn spread from North and South America through Europe, the Middle East, North Africa, and eventually into Sub-Saharan Africa, populations that had once depended on other grains for their sustenance switched rather rapidly to corn because it grew so well in these regions. This happens in Egypt, but it especially happens after the construction of the dam because corn has a very similar growing cycle to cotton in Egypt. So in parts of Egypt that grew cotton, maize also becomes a really important crop. Some of it's exported, some of it's consumed locally. And in what happens in populations that depend too heavily on corn for sustenance, unless you process corn in a particular kind of way, which indigenous populations in North and South America knew how to do and did, unless you engage in that process of production, many of the nutrients that corn contains are not biologically available to your body. And so an over-reliance on the consumption of corn produces what is in essence a severe nutritional deficiency that has incredibly severe symptoms. And so one of the features of Egypt's colonial economy and the spread of perennial irrigation is the really visible prevalence of pellagra in many of the communities that also grow cotton. Now finally, and in some ways most importantly, a disease known as schistosomiasis or bilharzia, depending on where you are coming from, also spread really dramatically in Egypt with the construction of the dam. Bilharzia is in some ways, it is often associated with Egyptian history. British archaeologists found the parasitic worms that cause schistosomiasis in ancient Egyptian mummies. And so this kind of historical relationship between bilharzia and Egypt is often talked about even in contemporary literature within global public health. One of the arguments that I want to make really strongly is that while schistosomiasis is endemic in Egypt, it became an epidemic in huge numbers after the construction of the dam. So it is not unusual for an increased prevalence of schistosomiasis to be connected to dam construction. That happened in other parts of the globe as well. And by talking about this disease as one that's endemic, what you are doing is you are alighting the piece of the history that's strongly connected to both the construction of dams, the spread of new forms of agriculture, but also the absence of any form of public health during the British colonial period. So in Egypt in particular, there are different species of schistosoma parasites that cause the disease. 2 of them are prevalent in Egypt, and if we have time, I'll talk a little bit about how that evolves during the 20th century. So the 2 species of parasites that cause schistosomiasis in Egypt are Schistosoma hematobium and Schistosoma mansoni. Okay, now in just a second, I want to talk about what it meant to live in the bodies of Egyptian farmers after the construction of the dam. But before I do that, I want to make the observation that in some ways it's not deeply historically reflective to think about pellagra, hookworm, and schistosomiasis as distinct diseases. So although they are distinct diseases and they have different causes, the experience of patients, and in this case, the populations of the Egyptian countryside who suffered from these diseases, most cultivators suffered from more than one of these diseases. It was very, very common to suffer from all 3, which meant the experience of the symptoms of these diseases was linked, combined in really complicated ways, and often made more severe by the presence of more than one new infection in the body. So just to give you a sense of this, the sort of complex experience of being a farmer in a perennially irrigated system in Egypt during the first half of the 20th century would have included some combination of the following symptoms. So fatigue, fever, aching, cough, diarrhea, blood in the urine, cancer of the bladder, high blood pressure through the liver, an enlarged spleen, the buildup of fluid in the abdomen, swollen areas in the esophagus and digestive tract that can rupture and bleed, weight loss, abdominal pain, severe anemia, stunted growth, difficulty concentrating, a gnawing, throbbing pain in the epigastrium, which is this region right here, flatulence, constipation, impotence, fluid retention in various regions of the body, a photosensitive rash that appeared in spring, vomiting, and disorders of the nervous system that cause memory loss, depression, and eventually dementia. Now, I wanted to sort of work through this list of symptoms because I think it's really important to think about the fact that of the different historical experiences that have been associated with the construction of dams and of new forms of infrastructure, this is one facet of those experiences for populations living in Egypt. And in fact, some of these symptoms were so common that agricultural populations understood them to be part of the sort of natural process of adolescence. So an example of this is that one of the symptoms of schistosomiasis is blood in the urine. Usually what happened, the work of irrigation was typically done by men, and it was typically done by men after they had reached their teenage years or adolescence. And so some rural populations thought about this blood in the urine of boys as a form of male menstruation because it appeared in adolescence, it was incredibly common, and it was, you know, one of the kind of primary experiences of what it meant to sort of grow and pass through one's physical being and be involved in agriculture. So, you know, there certainly was knowledge of ill health and of not feeling well, but that all of these symptoms were caused by particular diseases, there was not widespread knowledge of that, and in large part, that was linked to the fact that while the British colonial project was highly invested in the production of cotton, they were minimally invested in the construction of medical facilities, treatment campaigns, or public health programs. And so just to give you a sense as to what this looked like, the same Rockefeller Foundation parasitologist that did the survey of hookworm also did one of schistosomiasis during the 1930s, and he estimated, and parasitic diseases are pretty easy to diagnose and to locate. He estimated that approximately 60% of Egyptians were infected with schistosomiasis, and that in areas that grew cotton and had historically grown cotton, that number could be as high as 90%, okay? So, you know, one of the arguments that I want to make really strongly about, okay, I'm gonna skip through a few slides, but one of the arguments before moving on that I want to make really strongly about these diseases is that it's really important to think that these diseases were shaping and influential during a period of Egyptian history, but they were also demarcated by questions of race, class, and gender. So elite Egyptians who were not engaged in the act of agriculture normally were not infected with these diseases. Neither were the British colonial administrators or the wealthy European populations who lived in Egyptian cities during the late 19th and the early 20th century. The gender piece of this, I think, is really interesting because while both men and women were infected with these diseases, with respect to schistosomiasis in particular, men tended to suffer from schistosomiasis. They tended to suffer from more severe cases and in higher numbers because they did the physical work of canal excavation and irrigation. So women worked in irrigation canals, but in different ways. And schistosomiasis is a parasitic infection that becomes more severe as the worm load in your system increases, and that's in part a feature of exposure. Okay, so that I actually don't keep you here for 6 hours, and I want to reassure you that I can come back and show you some of the images that I was going to show before. The last piece of the puzzle that I would like to talk about are the structures of knowledge, and specifically biomedical knowledge that grew up around this epidemic of disease in Egypt. So in the early 1920s, the British colonial regime in Egypt was partially replaced by a newly independent Egyptian state. It was really a quasi-independent Egyptian state, but it was a state that was controlled largely by Egyptian elites and large landowners. And yet, despite that fact, the symptoms of especially parasitic disease had become so prevalent in the Egyptian countryside, and especially large landowners were concerned about the productivity of their workforce. And so one effect of that was the establishment and spread of treatment campaigns for schistosomiasis in particular. And so during the First World War, the British became newly enthusiastic about developing treatment treatments for schistosomiasis, in particular because British troops were stationed, large numbers of British troops were stationed on Egyptian soil, and they were very, very concerned about British soldiers becoming infected with these diseases. And so treatment regimens were developed, and they were regimens that were used in large numbers after the war and with the rise of this new quasi-independent Egyptian state. So beginning in the 1920s and stretching really through the early 1990s, one of the primary sort of features of Egypt's public health apparatus was the project to treat schistosomiasis. So beginning in the 1920s, treatment centers and annexes were built throughout the Egyptian countryside, and treatment programs were also built within hospitals. This is an image of one of the more rural facilities from a site in the Nile Delta, which was really the kind of heartland of Egyptian cotton production. I'm going to show you a few more images. So all of these images are from a report that was produced by the Egyptian Ministry of Health in 1924. This is a deeply staged image, and I can tell you how we know it's deeply staged, of Egyptians being treated for schistosomiasis in these treatment facilities. One of the things that becomes really important is that schistosomiasis was treated via a series of injections with a compound known as tartar emetic. Tartar emetic is highly toxic, and the side effects of these injections were significant. And in order to treat the disease, it took approximately a month of residing in one of these treatment facilities to receive these injections. Nonetheless, because of both physical pain and also what was certainly coercion on the part of large landowners, large numbers of Egyptians were treated for schistosomiasis in these facilities, so that by the middle of the 1940s, about 500,000 Egyptians passed through these treatment facilities every year and received these injections to treat their schistosomiasis infections. Now, this is a really complicated story because how effective these treatment regimens were is a topic of unresolved debate. They were certainly toxic, and in some ways their efficacy is less important than the fact that their efficacy was diminished by the fact that when cultivators and rural residents were treated for disease, they returned to their communities and became infected, right? Through the kinds of pathways of daily life that they had initially become infected through. Now, just a quick note, which is that in the second half of the 20th century, schistosomiasis continued to be one of the primary public health crises in Egypt. So in the 1950s and the 1960s, under the regime of Gamal Abdel Nasser, the project to treat schistosomiasis was incredibly important for not only the Egyptian regime, but also a newly active set of chemical and pharmaceutical companies who became involved in the programs, especially of the World Health Organization. So this project sort of became divided during the 1950s and the 1960s, whereas on the one hand, Egyptian bodies were treated for schistosomiasis, and on the other hand, the countryside and especially irrigation canals were blanketed in huge quantities of chemicals that were intended to kill the tiny freshwater snails that serve as the intermediate hosts for schistosoma parasites. Neither of these projects were particularly useful. So, I can talk about that in the discussion because today schistosomiasis is no longer a public health problem in Egypt to anywhere near this extent. And that was a development that largely happened because of rural to urban migration, the construction of infrastructure, and especially infrastructure tied to water, which is a project that begins really for the first time in the 1950s and the 1960s, and also the development of new treatment regimens. So I'm currently working on a new project that is about the second half of the 20th century and a project of global public health, and how that project was imagined differently in Egypt, in Geneva, and also on the boards of pharmaceutical companies, and what that meant for the individuals who suffered from diseases like schistosomiasis. Okay, very, very quickly, I want to return to this question that I posed at the beginning, which seems like now 90 hours ago. This question of the relationship between, how we think about environmental transformation and the production of medical systems. So what I'm not going to do is to propose an easy or a pat answer to the question that I asked you at the beginning, but rather to say that as we live through our contemporary moment and think towards the future, I am increasingly attuned to the fact that while we talk about medicine and medical specialties and treatments as a kind of global system to a universal human problem, I am increasingly aware and in some ways alarmed by the fact that we do know historically that depending on where you live on the globe and where you are situated in relation to social structures, that you are likely to suffer from the effects of environmental transformation differently. So how climate change is lived in this place will look very different than how it is lived in urban neighborhoods that are located close to highways, will look very different to how it is lived. I've been following just really closely these heat waves that have happened recently in South Asia and India and Pakistan, and the just massive casualties that have been affected because of those heat waves. And so the question that I think about often is this question of how we can think about human health and specifically the design of medicine in ways that are in tune with those differences, and how we all might also, as potential patients of those medical systems, shape those systems in ways that are likely to actually promote health. And I think I'm going to stop with that because I want to make sure to leave enough time for questions and discussion. So thank you so much for your time today. I really, really appreciated your patience. I ran over like I always did, but nobody threw me out. So thank you very, very much.
We do have time for questions, so questions for Dr. Derr?
Yes. Yes. Sorry, there's nothing I like more than a quick question. Yes.
You mentioned that the indigenous peoples, North and South America, have
Yeah.
processing lands to get more nutrients. Is that something that's still done, or talk about how that's done if we do it today still?
That's it. So I'm not going to pretend to be an expert in that, but what I know about that is the following. So oftentimes, corn was treated with an alkaline that was sometimes, and that alkaline transformed the structure of the corn so that it was biologically available to human bodies. What happens is that corn moves across the Atlantic Ocean without that kind of respect for indigenous knowledge systems and knowledge ways, and so that same knowledge did not move. My understanding is that in communities that still rely, in communities especially in South America that still rely heavily on corn consumption, that process still happens. And yet, I think also, I think it is less common for communities to rely as heavily on a single crop than perhaps it was in the 1500s and 1600s. And I say that tentatively because I'm sure there are examples of cases in which that's not the case. But for example, so pellagra, it's a historically fascinating disease. So pellagra is called pellagra because as corn moves to the old world, the first place the disease appears is in Italy. So Italian peasants, especially living in the south, polenta becomes a kind of crop of the poor. And so the over-reliance on cornmeal, basically, without the processing it to make it biologically available, it results in sort of massive outbreaks of pellagra in Italy. Until the first parts of the 20th century, people don't have a good sort of theory as to how that happens. So the discovery of corn is a relatively later discovery that happens really after the First World War. That's when that sort of theory really spreads. For a long time, it was just thought to be a disease of poverty and of malnutrition, which in some ways it is, but it's not only that. Other questions? Yes?
It was just really interesting how those parasites and diseases attack people that were, of course, outside working all the time.
Yeah.
Is there any other research that you've done on situations like that in other parts of the world?
So my own, I'm not a infectious disease specialist or a parasitologist, I should say that. And so I consume that research, but I don't produce that research. And my own research is, really almost exclusively in the Middle East and North Africa. So I do, I work in Arabic, that was where I trained. And so I think that kind of regional specificity as a historian is really important. But what's really interesting about schistosomiasis and what we had to sort of jump through today is that one of the reasons it can be such a crisis is that it infects your unbroken skin through contact with infected water. So essentially what happened is these new irrigation canals that were dug throughout the countryside were great habitats for these tiny freshwater snails that serve as the intermediate hosts for schistosoma parasites. And so cultivators just really needed to be in the water. They contain the parasites and also these snails to become infected with the parasites. Interestingly enough, it's also talked about, I think, really problematically as a disease of sanitation because it's associated with urine and feces. So the eggs exit the human body in urine and feces. And in the 1930s, the Rockefeller Foundation decides that if they build a bunch of latrines throughout the Egyptian countryside, that will somehow reduce the prevalence of parasitic disease. It turned out to have no impact on the presence of parasitic disease for complicated reasons. But one of those reasons was that the quantity of parasite that needs to be in the water is really small in order for it to be deeply infectious. And so that is, schistosomiasis continues to be a problem, especially in areas in which large dams are built, and it's endemic many places on the globe. One of the tricks of that is the prevalence of the disease began to go down pretty dramatically in the 1980s and 1990s with the development of a new treatment regimen, but it's a treatment regimen that's often used preventatively, meaning that children are given a pretty severe biomedical intervention as a way to prevent them from developing schistosomiasis, which I would argue is not an ideal solution. That was a long answer to your question. It was just an excuse to sneak some things in. Yeah.
So you're talking about how this tended to happen north of the Ashmore Dam and
Yes.
south, because
Yeah.
in the south they continue to have the same basin irrigation. So was that ever in anyone's mind back then that the south was only having these problems? Okay.
Yeah, so they absolutely understood this. So that survey I talked about that produced this 60% of the population number, that same survey estimated that in areas of practice basin irrigation, only 5% of the population was infected. And so this relationship between perennial irrigation and schistosomiasis, it was understood really by the First World War.
And then follow-up question, how that impact kind of the economy and the relation between the north and the south and kind of that socioeconomic factor?
So what happens is that every time the dam is raised, that irrigation frontier moves south. And there's schistosomiasis. Okay, so that irrigation frontier that I showed you was also, that's a map of disease ecologies, and that shifts south as irrigation water moves south. What is really interesting is that in the lead up to building the Egyptian High Dam, which replaced the dam that I was talking about, in the lead up to building the High Dam during the 1950s and the 1960s, it was anticipated that that would result in a nationwide increase of schistosomiasis, precisely for the reasons that you outlined. It didn't. And so, I mean, one of my favorite things, I say favorite, and that's the wrong word, but about ecologies is the way they can surprise us because they are so complicated. And so that is a great example of that. What did eventually happen is that in the early part of the 20th century, the parasite that usually caused schistosomiasis in Egypt was Schistosoma hematobium. That flip-flops. So by the second half of the 20th century, Schistosoma mansoni becomes the more common cause of disease because it starts to migrate out of the relatively smaller areas in which it was endemic through these new networks of irrigation canals. So that shifts pretty dramatically.
Would it
Yes?
surprise you to see any more of these ecological disasters occurring in the future? In terms of, I mean, do you,
I mean, I think this is our future. In the sense that,
unexpected results?
yeah.
Construction projects or?
So I'm not a techno-optimist in the way that I think that when we imagine massive technological solutions to especially the problems of climate change, my assumption is always that there will be effects that we do not anticipate. Yeah. Wait, did I answer your question? Did I not?
Yes, you did, yeah, I mean, you've answered it in the past, but you've also considered what could happen, and what are the chances that something like this could happen, and
I mean, this story in some ways is happening because, you know, I was at a conference a couple of years ago that was a conference of sort of, I was a unique historian. There were a lot of people who worked on water and specifically on dam construction. And my understanding is that the period in which we're living in, there are more large dams being built on the globe than at any other point in history. And so, you know, schistosomiasis is not unique to Egypt. And I think, you know, something that I think about a lot is then when the costs of dam construction are imagined, those costs usually do not include the cost of public health programs that will be needed to deal with the effects of dam construction in some places, right? So we separate agriculture and infrastructure from the bigger questions of public health, especially when it comes to producing a cost-benefit analysis. Is that closer?
yeah, my question was kind of vague, but yeah. Has this kind of thing stopped, but it's not stopped?
It's not stopped. It's not stopped. I feel like I'm neglecting this side of the Zach.
Yeah, I was so curious about the dimension of labor that you're talking about.
Yeah.
And so, like in the environmental bodies, and what you, in the book you said, you wrote Blockade, talk about like building a phenomenology of pain.
Yeah.
And so I was curious. I come to really closely related things here. One, I was curious why you decided to take that approach, like to the lived experiences of the workers, to tell
Yeah.
history from that perspective. And then I was also curious about if you came across any stories of, for example, like building self-determination or resistance through organized labor or anything like that along the Nile in the course of these environmental stories.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm gonna try not. I'm gonna try not to give you a 15-minute answer. Okay. So I mean, to answer your first question, I think that, you know, especially within the discipline of history, you know, there's a rich body of work that talks about labor. But so little of that work thinks about labor as embodied or as physical. And for me, it's a big problem. You know, I am not a farmer. I have not worked in I've not done the work of agriculture in a serious way. But when I look at the effects of labor, not only in agricultural context, but also in industrial context, obviously disease and pain and the breaking of bodies seem fundamental to that to me. So it was really important to me to write about that, to write about those facets of what it meant to do work. I also, you know, this is also connected, I think, to how historians imagine identity. So historians use particular categories to think about identity. We think about identity as a question of nationality, a question of religion, a question of gender, you know, these kinds of very conscious attachments to how we think about who we are as subjects. And I thought something really large was missing in the fact that we are not disembodied minds running around the universe, right? Like our minds are deeply physical, and how we encounter the world is a deeply embodied process. And so, I think personally, I grew up in California in a farm town in the 80s and the 90s where there was a lot of debate and conversation around pesticide use and the effects of those pesticides on the bodies of farm workers. And so I think that when I moved to Egypt in my early 20s, I in part imagined agriculture as something that could be physically harmful. And so I think I was, I wouldn't say looking for that, but aware of that. And there's a whole other story about pesticide use in Egypt, but I'd like to talk about this later, but I think that, I feel like now I'm in a confessional session, but I do think about the body as a really important locus of experience or site of experience. I now forgot about your second question. Okay, I'll come back to you. Yes, okay. There was another question I saw that was, yes.
In this age of globalization, the travels around the world, how well prepared, this is your opinion, how well prepared are American physicians to recognize in world travelers the effect of these diseases?
So I've not had one of these diseases, but analytically or anecdotally, I can say, there are not very many specialists in tropical medicine that are in the US. So anecdotally, I know that people have had difficulty doing that. I'm torn about what I think about that, right? Because on the one hand, I do think that local medical specialization should be geared locally, right? So I think that I don't think it's possible for physicians working in any one site to be experts in everything, right? So, what happens in Egypt in the second half of the 20th century is Egyptian physicians become, very skilled and very knowledgeable and do a ton of research about these diseases, research that's not featured very often when we talk about the histories of these diseases, unfortunately. And so I think that, American physicians, I think, generally are not great at recognizing diseases that are not common. But maybe I think that's okay. Yeah. And then I'm going to use your story in a talk, and
It's a good one.
I will say that if when I lived in Egypt, had I been suspicious that I was infected with a parasitic disease, I would not have come back to the States to have it diagnosed.
Mm-hmm.
But that would be an argument that I would make about anywhere. Like if you think you are suffering from something that is more common in place, I think you stay in place.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This is a conversation I think we could go on all night, so I'm going to probably move us back to the library to continue to have the conversation. But thank you so much for coming to Iowa and visiting us.